Welcome back, everybody, to another episode of The Hopeful Majority. Thank you, by the way, so much for the feedback on last week's episode with Irshad Manji. If you haven't already checked that out, we talked about how to have difficult conversations in incredibly divisive times, a very relevant topic, as you can tell. And just so you know, if you're just joining us, every Monday, YouTube, Spotify, Apple, that's where we drop new content. That's where you can check out Irshad's episode from last week. With that, this week, the question we've got: what's happening on America's college campuses? In case you haven't noticed, whether it's at USC or UT Austin or UC Berkeley, Columbia University, we're seeing mass protest, mass conflict, turmoil, pain, extremism. We're seeing instances of anti Semitism. We're seeing Muslim students feeling under threat. What is going on? And normally I would have a guest on to discuss this topic. And in fact, Irshad's episode was really interesting on this. But in case you might not know and you're new to the show, again, welcome. We love to talk about divisive issues and have productive conversations with different perspectives. And I lead an organization called Bridge USA, which has college and high school chapters across the country. In fact, we have 65 college chapters, 20 high school chapters. We have chapters at a lot of these affected institutions on campus. We engage approximately 10,500 students. And why do I bring up that context? Well, you might be interested to know that a lot of folks have been asking us, what are we seeing on college campuses? What are we noticing? What are students saying? And importantly, what are the lessons we can take away? So, with that context, I want to give you a little bit of a perspective, my reaction, what I'm hearing, what I think are the lessons that we can learn from. What is the story that the media is missing? That's what we're going to talk about on this episode. And I guess you could call this a quote unquote emergency podcast session because, again, we wanted to have a conversation with the guests, but we wanted to also tell you and show you what our students are saying, because I think there's a lot of interesting nuggets of wisdom, truth, fascinating intrigue that I think can help us, importantly, solve for the future, because we got to build that better world. So with that, let's cue the intro and let's get into what I'm seeing, hearing, and learning from on America's college campuses so that hopefully it's helpful with you. So, what are we seeing in America's college campuses? What's happening? What's going on? Well, before I actually get into this, and importantly, I want to let you know that I'm grounding this conversation in what our chapters have been doing in the last 2 weeks on different colleges, our amazing young student leaders. This work would not be possible without them. Before I get into that, I want to just let you know that I had a conversation with 8 of our student leaders from last week, and they represented the following institutions. They represent Columbia University, UC Berkeley, UT Austin, NYU, Stanford, and USC. All campuses that have been the headlines for different reasons as it relates to Campus Challenge. And so a lot of what I'm going to be talking about is in relation to that conversation I had and also what we're seeing. Before I get into that, though, and before I articulate the 3 things that I want you to take away from this episode, I want to give you a little bit of context of my story. Now, some of the folks that have already listened to the Hopeful Majority know this, but I know that our majority keeps building because I think most people in this country want to have productive conversations, listen to each other, treat each other with respect. Importantly, most of us want to solve problems. So as this majority has been building, I want to reintroduce a little bit of my background as to why I got involved, because I think it'll give you a little bit of a perspective into how I've been thinking about the deep challenges, pain, turmoil, difficulty that we're seeing across university administrations, student bodies, alumni groups, etc. So 2017, February 2nd, 2017, I want to take you back to this day that really changed my perspective. I was a pre-med student, in case you might not know. I had no interest in politics or democracy, at least to the extent that I have now. I was a pre-med student going to school at UC Berkeley. February 2nd, 2017, there's a speaker invited to campus named Milo Yiannopoulos. Now, some of you may have heard of this name, some of you may not have, but Milo was a provocateur, to say the least. And that day, I was walking back from my math seminar when Milo was supposed to be scheduled to speak. And again, I had no interest in the speech or anything because I'm a pre-med student. And I'm walking back, right? And I walk past this cafe, and overhead there's helicopters flying overhead, and there's violence and shouting in the distance. Now, this is Berkeley. We have a great relationship with protests. We protest big things, small things. So this is kind of par for the course, right? But then as I'm walking past this cafe, right, this window is broken in, and inside the window, broken in cafe, there's a TV screen that said CNN, UC Berkeley students protest free speech. And importantly, the television crew filming that segment is standing right next to me. And that's the breaking of the fourth wall. That's where suddenly I went from being a spectator of democracy and politics for my entire life to suddenly being thrust into this position of feeling like a participant, feeling like what I would do over the next couple of hours, the way that my community would respond over the next couple of days would really define the narrative. So I went to this campus protest to see what's going on out of genuine curiosity. And man, I was so pained. I saw violence, I saw conflict, I saw hundreds of state troopers being brought in. Importantly, I saw a lot of peaceful students protesting Milo's speech because they didn't want him to speak. I saw a lot of students that wanted to defend Milo's right to speak also present. But interestingly enough, and importantly, I also saw a lot of outside agitators rush in, groups from outside the community, folks like Antifa coming in wearing all black clad, throwing fireworks at the police officers, only driving further conflict and derision, which then led to an overreaction from the police because they, again, had to lock down the situation because it was getting out of hand. And the next day, after seeing the fires on campus and seeing just how pained the student community was, me and some fellow young people got together and we wanted to create a space for dialogue. And that eventually grew into Bridge USA. And you can check out some other episodes from some of our early episodes to be able to see the journey of Bridge. So I won't get into that. But why do I start with this? Because this is how I got involved. This is how I got started. I share this because what we're seeing on campuses today reminds me and throws me back to February 2nd, 2017. This is why I got involved. And I'll tell you that I had two hypotheses coming out of that experience. The first hypothesis is grounded in what happened that night when the protests were happening. The first hypothesis is that I believed that most of the students protesting, whether you might agree or disagree with what they're protesting, that I believe that most of them that were protesting were relatively peaceful. I saw that most students just wanted to have their voice heard. And that's their right. That's what protests, that's the importance of this country. Democracy thrives in disagreement because that's how we push our union forward towards the values and ideals that we aspire for, right? But the way that those protests started to become violent was not because of the students, but because of outside agitators, which then resulted in overreaction from the police. And the media narrative the next day was UC Berkeley students violently protest the speaker's speech. Now, in truth, that was accurate to an extent, but what it missed was the nuance and complexity of how those protests started, what caused the protests to grow, what caused them to turn violent, the influence of outside folks, and importantly, how then the media inflamed the divisions by covering not what initially sparked and caused the protest and the broader conversation, but they focused on the violence. And that was the narrative and coverage. And so what I did was I got together with some people. We put out this article where we circulated a petition that said, "We, the students of UC Berkeley, condemn violence." And bipartisan support across the board. So my first hypothesis is that I think that a lot of the students that are trying to express themselves in today's moment are doing so because they genuinely want to be heard and they feel like they haven't had the opportunity to say what's on their mind. And you'll see where I'm going with this because when people can't speak, they shout. And when people can't shout, they fight. And we have not created the spaces for dialogue and deliberation on our campuses, in our city halls, in our school boards, in our workplaces, in our local community centers. And so as a result, we have deep mistrust and fear of each other. Second hypothesis coming out of that day. Most students on campus, I think, genuinely wanted to have a conversation. Most students were not necessarily focused on violence. Importantly, I think the problem was that you had a vocal minority, a vocal extreme minority on both sides of the issue, aggravating the issue, which meant that there was a loud event that caused a silent majority, what I call the hopeful majority of students that just wanted to have the conversation, be completely quiet. They were fearful. They were scared. And so then the story on campus was students don't want conversation, which then caused the university to say, well, man, we can't have dialogues. We can't have conversations. These students are crazy. You know, what's going on with Gen Z? But my hypothesis was that most people wanted to have the conversation. So when we held that space of discussion after that initial night, we had so many students show up. People are like, please, we want more of this. In fact, those conversation spaces turned into Bridge Berkeley, which turned into other campus organizations. And we had friends at Bridge Notre Dame, Bridge Colorado Boulder already building stuff. And it turned into this national movement called Bridge USA. which then brought me to the hopeful majority. So, two hypotheses, right? One is that most students want to have the conversation, but they're just silent and fearful, and that the universities failed to engage those students. And so then you just have this vocal minority controlling the narrative. And the second hypothesis is that I think a lot of students are protesting because they genuinely care and they want to be peaceful. But you have the influence of outside agitators, outside money that then inevitably results in what I think makes sense is a police response because you have to secure the space. And then you have a constant media that's shining a spotlight on division, which then detracts from the entire reason why the people protest in the first place. See what I'm getting at? The outrage industrial complex that we live in, right? So, why do I share those two hypotheses? Well, when I had this conversation with the 8 students last week that represented Columbia, Berkeley, UT Austin, NYU, Stanford, USC, I found 3 observations that I want to share with you, and then we'll wrap this up. 3 observations. And the disclaimer I'll give you is that every campus is different. Every campus is different. The protests at Columbia were violent, and there was a lot of challenge, and there was a lot of anti-Semitic rhetoric that was coming out of those protests, especially from the pro-Palestinian camps. And yes, there was a lot of important and important voices and students that wanted to have the conversation, but that was Columbia. Whereas at UT Austin, you had purely peaceful protests, and the university overreacted. So I want to put the big disclaimer out that it's very hard to paint this entire moment with a monolith. Campuses, colleges, high schools, every place is different. Every community is different. So there's a little bit of nuance involved. So remember, the hopeful majority, we're trying to inculcate and elevate nuance. So let's put on our nuance caps and walk through this with me. Here are the 3 broad things that I found. And I have actual quotes that I want to share with from this conversation with our students. And obviously, I want to protect their identity and all of that. So it's just the quotes that I heard. Here's what I saw. So, first observation is that the university administrations at most of these campuses have no idea what to do and how to respond to these protests. And the students, they don't know what to do. In fact, the way that I came out of this call with these students and what I've seen on our chapters is that the university administrations feel like a scared parent. They're like, they don't know what to do. And as a result, what you have is things like an overreaction at UT Austin, where the university unleashed the police on peaceful protests, purely peaceful protests, where students were just on the lawn saying what they wanted to say. And it was wrong because it caused student speech to be silenced. And importantly, students were doing what is their right on a public campus. On the other hand, you had places where you had underreaction, like at Columbia, which caused the situation to totally get out of hand and caused universities like UT Austin to respond preemptively. In fact, one of the students said, quote, "The one thing that has united our student body is the frustration we have towards our university response." And right after that, another quote I have is that I hope we can work with the administration to diffuse the situation and facilitate the free exchange of ideas. I don't think there's any other way to make students feel heard, seen, and safe. Students want the conversation. They want the dialogue. The problem is that our universities have not invested the time and space and effort to actually start to build cultures of pluralism and belonging on their campuses. Think about it like this. If you have 2 populations, Israeli students and Palestinian students, and they've never interacted with each other, and suddenly their identities are at risk because of a conflict in the Middle East around Israel and in Gaza, what do you think is going to happen when you have 2 groups that have never engaged with each other suddenly at odds? They're going to fight. They're going to be deeply mistrustful. Universities have an obligation, if they want to prevent this in the future, and this will happen again in the future. I'll call it right now. The second anniversary of October 7th to November 4th, this fall, 2024, I think will be incredibly tumultuous on campuses. Universities would not be in this position where they don't know what to do if they can start now to support widespread student bridge building efforts. Elevate the young people on your campuses that want to have the conversations. Start creating spaces and centers where dialogue is flourishing. Because here's observation number 2. Because I can already hear somebody that's working at a university saying, well, Manu, all I'm seeing is the protests and violence on campuses. What's the situation? Here's the situation. Majority of students would be interested in having the conversation, but they're scared. They're scared. Our universities, our workplaces, our societies have become cultures of fear because people are scared to say what's on their mind because they're scared to be judged. They haven't practiced the skill of dialogue and engagement. That's the hope. That's why the show is called The Hopeful Majority. Most people in the country want to have the dialogue. Most people in the country want to have the conversation. Most people in the country want to treat each other with respect. Most people in the country want to see each other's pain. So the question is, what are we doing about it? Because the time is now to act. Because students, young people, we want to be able to talk to each other to solve our problems. What we're seeing now is a result of people not being able to speak, so then they resort to shouting. Not being able to shout, so they resort to being able to fight. And what happens in all of this is that we forget to actually solve the real problem of the original pain and alienation that caused a lot of the challenges that we're seeing on campuses. And then it's all about hate speech and it's all of that debate is important, but what really matters is, are we investing the capacity of tomorrow's leaders to be able to have the conversation today? I'll give you two quotes. Some of our students said, the most interesting group of students are the students who are afraid to speak out or don't have anything to say. That's the majority of students. How are we engaging them? Second quote, there are people who are forming in mini groups to come and discuss these issues. Can you believe that? Underground dialogue groups are forming between students because they're like, somebody's got to have the conversation. That's actually how Berkeley started after the Milo events. So you're seeing students start to take this in their own hands. And that's what we're doing with the Hopeful Majority. That's what we're doing with Bridge USA. That's what you're doing. Listen to this, is supporting efforts like that. But here's the secret. When you see tragic events take place and then you see subsequent extreme vitriolic discourse, dialogue, whether it's on social media or in person, remember that it's a vocal minority of people controlling the narrative while the rest of us stay silent. And that's the opportunity for us. It's time to elevate. It's time to raise our voices, to demand the need for dialogue and conversation, because know that the majority of people are behind you. Last observation. People seek maximum agreeableness when there's fundamental mistrust and fear of the other. What do I mean by that? It's a quote I got from a student that said that it's extremely loud and extremely radical in areas where people all agree with each other. And importantly, when you don't have the space to be able to talk to people that are different than you and you feel like you can't actually have that debate and discussion, naturally, people are going to start, human nature, people are going to start to look to the spaces where they find people that agree with them. And when you find people you agree with in these moments where we need to have discussions across lines of difference to solve our problems, inevitably, you're going to have more radical thought and people are going to start to build on each other's agreement. And yes, while it's important to have those spaces for safety, and yes, it's important to have those spaces for belonging, the fact is that we're not going to solve our issues until we talk to the other, whoever the other may be in our perspective. And so we got to start creating those spaces, because if we don't, then what you're going to have is a phenomenon of extreme constant radicalization of ideas, because people are only going to seek spaces of comfort, and spaces of comfort are important, but there's a time for them. And the time right now is for us to get out there and be in brave spaces of conversation. So what does this all lead me to? What all of this leads me to is that the problem that we're seeing on college campuses, the story that is missing is that most young people want to have the conversation. The university administrations don't know that and are scared and don't know how to act. So they either underreact or overreact, but don't actually solve the problem. And ultimately, you have a condition for constant conflict. And what we need to start doing is we need to start building the permission structures in our universities, in our workplaces, in our local community centers to be able to have the conversation. The permission structures. I guarantee you, if in the fall most students stand up and say, no, we want dialogue. We want conversation. We want to resolve our issues. We say no to hate. We say no to extremism. What we want is for us to have spaces on this campus to see and meet each other's pain, not for the purpose of a political agenda, but for the purpose of solving our damn problems. I guarantee you the permission structure is going to shift, and the university administrations are going to respond. And they're going to respond with the capacity of not force through police, but understanding through spaces of conversation. And that's what we need more of. That's what I'm seeing in college campuses. That's what we're seeing in educational spaces. And I hope that that helped a little bit in shaping the way that we're thinking about this, because all of this builds up to the hopeful majority. I'm so grateful to you for listening. I appreciate you supporting us. You and I are going to build this thing together, because it takes all of us. We are what many might call the exhaust majority, but that's enough. Because if you want to create the permission structures and you want to have the incentive for conversation, it's time to be vocal about that need, so that people in power respond to that need. All people in power are hearing right now is the crazy stuff. So as a result, they're scared. Let's give them that backbone. Thank you so much for listening, and I'll see you next week.